Yeah, and the idea about having these particular source of supplied musicians was that, officers' children weren't going to run away. Orphan children weren't going to run away. The army was their family. So when they're up there on the front lines, because the musicians very much were on the front line, they weren't going to run away. They were there. They were in the fight, and they were going to hang around because that was what they had.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are with Daniel Aston and Mike Nelson of the Guilford Courthouse Fife and Drum Corps. So welcome.
Thank you.
The fife and drum, the musicians of the Continental Armies, were very, no pun intended, instrumental in moving people and armies into a battle and out of the battle, on the march, in the retreat. And so tell our listeners a little bit about y'all's group and just introduce yourselves to us.
All right. Well, I'm Mike Nelson, and we are the Guilford Courthouse Fife and Drum Corps. We're an all-volunteer organization. We all just have a love for history and a love for music and a determination to keep this type of music alive. We started the group back in '95, and we've been going ever since. We do everything from school groups to scout groups to monument dedications. We do a lot of work with the Sons of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the American Revolution. We do a lot of work with state and local sites. We also do work with the National Park Service, where we go and do programs. And our main focus is to try to educate people today on the use of music in the 18th century military.
Where are y'all located?
Home base is Greensboro, North Carolina. And we have a Facebook page. We also have a website, both of which are easy to find. You just look up Guilford Courthouse Fife and Drum. You'll pop right up to us, and our contact information and everything is on there. We are always looking for more people. We're always looking for new recruits. I actually was at the Guilford Courthouse National Military Park. I saw a sign posted on a bulletin board that was on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that said, "Musicians wanted. Inquire within. We'll help teach. Need fifers and drummers." And I was just intrigued enough to ask the ranger at the counter, who happened to be the person in charge of the Fife and Drum Corps. His name is Steve Ware. He started the Guilford Courthouse Fife and Drum Corps. Without Ranger Ware, we would not be in existence.
Wow.
But I basically learned and taught myself snare and playing with them, and the rest is 29 years of history.
How many of these events do y'all go to a year?
Wow. So far this year we've been to 8.
Yeah.
And we're only in the 6th month.
Yeah.
All right. Wow, very good. A little over one a month, and y'all must be a tight-knit group.
Some of us have been together for a long time,
Uh-huh.
and we have acquired some new members. Daniel is fairly new with the group, but Daniel came on board with some great enthusiasm and some fantastic musical skills. So he just walked right into it.
Wow.
But we've taken people from basically, a low-level music ability up into where they can play the fife and the drum. And it's weird how we meet people. One of our fifers, who's been with us for a relatively short period of time, she was my wife's physical therapist. My wife was a fife player. She took her fife to the physical therapy to make sure she could still do it. So the physical therapist was having her play. And Sharon heard her from across the physical therapy facility and came running because she heard a fife and had to see what it was all about. And she's been with us ever since.
That's
and she's fantastic. She's really enthusiastic. The folks that have come on board here lately have been super enthusiastic. They want to learn. They want to learn the history. They want to know the history. They want to help play. They want to help keep this music going. And they're just great people to be around.
But I think so much of history we forget about what it takes to do some of these things. Music was a huge part of the colonial times. You didn't have TV, you didn't have radio, you had dances, right?
Well, it's a great point. I mean, because even thinking back about as early as the mid 1600s here in the colonies, for instance, having access to church bells, which, church bells kind of regulate the day for people. Most people didn't have watches, and they certainly didn't have smartphones to tell them when, to do things. But they actually used a drum in its place during that time period.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I know we did we've had Zach Limhouse on from York County on our episodes or our podcast, and he talks about a pocket violin. He hasn't talked about it on the podcast, but he is a musician, and he has taken his pocket violin out and played some songs on that, and said that they would bring these to camps and that sort of thing, and it became the center of entertainment in those camps. And I would think the drum and the fife would also double as those type of entertainment.
Absolutely, yeah. So a lot of people think the life of a musician was relatively easy, but it actually wasn't. It had multiple duties that were assigned for fifers and drummers. One being what we've discussed here about communication on the battlefield in particular. But some of the other ones were camp duties. So camp duties throughout the day, the musicians were required to basically be the alarm clock for that regulated the entire camp, and when it comes to drill, when it comes to eating, when it comes to turning off the tap, which was, you asked earlier about what call might be the hardest for fifers and drummers to get. Well, that one might be one of the hardest ones. Yeah, because it was known as the tattoo, but it's the tap too. It's like it's time to turn off the keg, and then all the women would need to depart the camp. So.
Yes. That's a good story. I like it. Yeah, that's good.
And then some other things that the musicians would also have to do, like we're talking about, as esprit de corps. So we were responsible for actually, motivating and inspiring the troops to go out there and do their daily duties. So we would help inspire that motivation, whether it's time to go out and forage for wood. Or whether it's time to get in ranks and march on the battlefield. The musicians on the march, it was work. Of course, it was work for all troops to march from one place to another. But you're talking about anywhere from 10 to upwards of 20 miles in a day. Mm-hmm. And musicians were responsible for regulating the cadence of that particular regiment, division, or whatever it might be, or whatever size element. They would use the musicians to regulate that cadence, so they know when they would, roughly when they would arrive at the next location.
It begs the question if, Tarleton, when he went after Buford at the Waxhaws, coming up to the Waxhaws at Buford, they were marching from Charleston and catching up to Buford. Buford had a lot of days head start, and they were leaning, the infantrymen were leaning against the cavalry horses, grabbing a hold of the stirrup, putting a lot of their weight on the horses as they moved north to try to catch up with Buford. Do you know anything about whether or not the drummers came along, the musicians came along in that? Do you know anything about that?
Well, for the cavalry, they had musicians, but the drummer wouldn't necessarily be what regulated the tempo of that. But however, the cavalry would have known basically what tempo, what cadence that element from Buford's army would have been marching at roughly, because they knew generally the tempo and the beat patterns that they would use in order to march the men. so they would have an idea of just how fast they needed to go in order to catch up. That would be
that's a good point.
My suspicion.
Yeah, and that brings to mind the question of, did the Americans and the British have the same orders to the musicians?
Very
some
similar.
were, and some were slightly different.
Okay, what was different?
There were certain calls that were changed, but you have to understand that during the American Revolution, the musicians were most likely British trained.
Okay.
Because at that time we were still British citizens under the crown. We got our arms from Britain. We got all of our supplies from Britain. The fifes probably came from Britain or Britain colonies. We were importing pretty much everything. So you would have your militia would be still British, and they would be training it early on the way the British trained. So they would learn British commands. So you didn't change them.
That's a good point. I didn't think about that. We still had we talk about militia in just, it was the militia, but we're talking about, it was the militia system where they were training every month, right? All year long, under the same type of commands, even before the Revolutionary War. We're talking about everybody was trained in that same way. There's some uniformity to that anyway.
The militia were essentially a precursor to today's National Guard.
Right.
Because the militia would be called up if, say there was a terrible storm, the road was blocked. Who's going to clear the road? They would call up the local militia unit and send them out, because a group of men is going to accomplish a whole lot more as far as clearing a road than, say, one or two men trying to clear it themselves.
Sure.
So you would call up the militia and have them go out and take care of local uprisings, local issues, clearing roads, that kind of thing. They were out there at citizen soldiers.
You dressed up on the first night of this Waxhaw event. You dressed up. Did I see you in British attire?
No, you saw us in redcoats.
I see.
But not British attire. In the 18th century, the musicians wore opposing colors from their assigned regiments. So we represent, from the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, we represent the 1st, 2nd Maryland group that fought at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Being mid-Atlantic states, they would have been wearing blue coats with red trim. Therefore, we wear red coats with blue trim. And it can be confusing to a lot of people who don't know that simple fact that musicians wore the opposing colors. So we are often mistaken for British.
And today you're in totally different attire.
Today we were wearing our militia outfits.
I see.
Hunting shirts.
So did the militia and the Continental groups, did they all have musicians?
No, not all the groups had musicians. Most of the musicians that were hired by the commanders and paid for by the commanders. You really weren't issued a fifer and a drummer. But in order to get the commands out, and most of the commanders during that time were more affluent landowners, wealthy people. They had a little bit of expendable money, and they would hire themselves musicians in order to have that main communication line that's secondary to the commander himself.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because many of the colonels that raised their group had to fund their own group. That's how they became the colonels. They were giving them the uniforms, they were giving them the ammunition, they were giving them in a lot of cases the armament that they needed to go into battle. A lot of them supplied their own horses and that sort of thing, but those colonels would actually be providing those and that didn't change. Past the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, into the Civil War, those colonels, those leaders of those regiments were funding their units, and that's how they became the colonels, right? So, go ahead.
Yeah, well, one interesting aspect, too, to supplying musicians, the supply also came from the officers' children. So usually children from an age of around 13 to 17, the average age fifer and drummer in the Revolutionary War was 18 and a half years. But a lot of those musicians came from officers' children or orphaned children.
Oh, that's interesting. I know that at for instance, the Battle of Utah Springs, there was at least one drum major and a drummer that were of African descent. Certainly, they had the slaves and enslaved and freemen doing some of that too. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. At Battle of Cowpens, there's actually an African American bugler that was on the cavalry who was injured there, and so African Americans certainly served as musicians. There's actually a fifer from close to where I'm from, Fayetteville area, who also served in the Continental Army. He was African American. There's actually a statue of him downtown in Fayetteville honoring him. His name is Isaac Hammond.
Okay.
And the idea about having these particular source of supply to musicians was that, officers' children weren't going to run away. Orphan children weren't going to run away. The Army was their family. So when they're up there on the front lines, because the musicians very much were on the front line, they weren't going to run away. They were there. They were in the fight, and they were going to hang around because that was what they had.
It's a very good point. I didn't think about that. So tell me a little bit about the difference in the commands from a drummer standpoint, from a fife standpoint.
Some of the commands are done with both. A good example was before dinner this evening we played the meal call, which is called roast beef. That is a fife and drum tune. But simple marching maneuvers were oftentimes just a drum command. Like a right face would be just a single stroke followed by what's called a flam, which is a very quick double stroke. So you would have, that would be a right face, and that would simply be a drum command, whereas the more complicated commands often involved the fife as well.
Were there commands for when you needed them to make room for the front line of militia? For instance, at Cowpens, you had front line of militia, and after they had several volleys, 3 volleys, they needed to come to the rear of that particular battle, and you would make a command for the skirmishers or the next line of Continentals to separate just a little bit so they could come through their ranks. Was there anything like that?
So the battle plan was worked out ahead of time.
Okay.
So the troops knew what they were going to do. So, like for instance, whenever the first line of militia engaged, they fired their volleys, and then the drummer would beat retreat, and they would retreat, and then they would form back into their prescribed areas to fall back to, their assembly areas, and then they would reform and then enter the battle again. And because a lot of those troops, they did retreat behind the regulars. However, they did reform and re-engage the enemy also on the flanks.
So how is the drummer and the fife getting their commands?
So the drummer and the fifes got their commands from usually the sergeant that they were stationed by, because the fifes and drums were stationed on the line at the flank, so all the way at the end of the left side of the line and all the way in at the right side of the line. Sometimes they'd also have the drum major would be also stationed in the center with the fife major along with the officers. Okay. So the idea of that is that they would echo the commands along the line. So once the officer made the command, the drum major, fife major, whatever command was given, they would execute. The flanks would hear that from their sergeants, who they would echo it down the line, and then they would also play the music that was necessary to...
So it was almost like a cascading command from the center, cascading all the way down the line to the drum and fife at the end of each line, who would then echo that. Is that right?
That is my understanding of
Yes.
it.
That's very interesting. So the generals, how did they get their commands to the sergeant who's giving their commands to the drum major?
That's a good question.
Oftentimes it was runners.
Okay.
Because generally your generals are going to be well behind the battle, up on an elevated area, oftentimes watching the battle. so that they can orchestrate it and make the changes that they see necessary. But in order to do that, they would have to send a courier or a runner up to the command structure that was there on the front line and say, hey, you have this group coming up on your right, you need to engage to your right. So they would make them aware. They may not see that group. Like at Cowpens, there was the rise, and so the British were charging up over this rise, and they did not see the Americans stationed down below the rise until they crest the hill. Once they crest the rise, then they see them, and at that point it's almost too late. But as far as most of the commands for the simple things were generic and pretty simple to play and to hear, and you were drilled with those over and over again to the point where you knew them, you heard them, you knew that's what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had the more complex commands, the firing sequence, the prime and load. You're given a preparative. The drums played a preparative. The guys knows to get prepared to load the musket. Then they would go through the firing sequence, make ready, present, fire. And there were drum commands for each one of those steps. And so they're waiting to hear the drum commands in order to know, okay, they're in a ready position, but they're not taking aim until they're told to. They're not presenting. And then as far as firing, you want a crisp volley because the weapons were not super accurate. So you wanted to get the maximum amount of firepower lead going down range at one time so that you are creating basically a wall of lead versus people popping off one at a time. So you wanted to make sure that they fired together, so you would play a very loud flam stroke, which they knew that was coming once they had present. So they were prepared for it, but they held until they heard that. And they executed, and then you would have a better volley.
So in the Army, when you do right face, the right is the preparatory command. You don't actually turn right at that. When they say right, then they say face, and that's when you commit.
Exactly.
Right?
You have a preparatory command and a command of execution.
You do have preparatory commands.
Okay.
But the preparatory commands are not usually played. They're preparatory to get the musicians ready to know what's coming.
Okay.
Officers would often say, prepare to prime and load. So the musicians knew that they were getting ready to play the loading sequence. Then they would be given the command, prime and load. At that point, the musicians would kick in and start playing so that everyone knew at that point, execute. Start priming and loading your weapon.
Another example is like fixed bayonet. So they would perform that, but as soon as they performed that, like it was execute. It wasn't okay, wait around for another command. They just knew once they heard that it was time to fix bayonets. So the Fife primarily was used on the march, and it was primarily used in camp. It was not so much used on the actual battlefield per se. It was by the British more so than the Americans. The Americans used primarily the drum on the battlefield. For instance, the command that to fix bayonets, we would use. The English would use the first 4 bars of what was known on the English duty as reveille. And so the troops would know, they'd hear that and they knew it was time to fix bayonets. The Americans did use some of those calls, but most of the Americans, because they weren't as well trained, especially in the earlier part of the war, they primarily would use drum and rely on still vocal commands because the troops simply just did not know what to do. They did benefit from some of the carryover from the English training, from the British training. However, there's still a lot of folks that just did not know and did not have the formal training to execute those commands. Another thing that I would like to mention here too is the fife and drum. Actually, even for the British at the time, even though it was well trained and well versed, but the fife and drum had pretty much fallen completely out of British military doctrine in the late 1600s and up until around 1748 or so. And they pretty much stopped using fife and drum to regulate the army on the battlefield.
So why did they change it?
I am not real sure on why they changed it, but it just kind of fell out of fashion. They just stopped using it, but they were re-inspired after witnessing the Swiss, who continued to use it, and also the Prussian army. So some of the battles that took place in Europe, such as the 7 Years' War, the English were allies during that particular conflict. So they saw the effectiveness of using the fife and drum again. So they re-established it in British military doctrine in order to regulate troops on the battlefield.
That's fascinating stuff. That's good stuff right there. Do you know if they were used in particular battles? What battles were they used in?
The very first battle of the American Revolution, what we know is a shot heard around the world, Lexington Concord. There's a fifer there by the name of Thomas Nixon Jr., and he actually was the fifer that served during that particular first engagement. And then there's also a drummer by the name of William Diamond, who also served in that very first engagement. So, and those were militiamen.
Wow.
Those were not.
Okay. Did the artillery people have drummers, or was that something different?
Generally, no. The artillery would not have drummers because the artillery in and of itself is loud, and you're going to have when you're operating an artillery piece, your crew is generally very centralized. Mm-hmm. So communication is not that big of a problem. You're not spread out all over the place.
Gotcha.
You're working a gun, and there's usually 12 to 15 total people. But as far as the folks that are actually responsible for firing the gun, you're looking at about six, 7, because the other people are what are called matrosses, which were simply used to move the gun in place. So everyone is right there around the gun, working in very close concert with each other. They did not have the need for fife and drum.
Good stuff. Well, tell me, this is a question I ask as many people as I can when we do an episode. What does liberty mean to you?
Well, that's a great question, and I think we can look at our current society and kind of see what maybe it's not. And we have this idea that liberty is freedom with no bounds, meaning that I can do whatever I want to and pursue whatever I want to, and it doesn't matter if it's at the expense of the other person. So looking at that today, we see that the lack of consideration for other people and letting them pursue their happiness and their dreams. So I think of liberty as, somewhere in that we do have liberty, we have freedom, but it's all in the context of the collective, of my rights and what I choose to do should not infringe on the rights of my fellow countrymen, and that's kind of how I look at liberty. In my mind, there's no such thing as total unlimited freedom. It's a freedom within the confines and of the collective, of allowing other people the opportunity to also pursue their dreams and pursue whatever makes them happy.
Tell our listeners a little bit more about how they can get a hold of you, where they can find your information, and if they're interested in reaching out, how do they do that?
Well, as stated before, you can go and look us up on Facebook. We also have YouTube videos out there, and also a web page. So it's Guilford Courthouse Fife and Drum, and you just check that in the search bar, and it will pull us up. And we are tickled to death to communicate back and forth with people. We have folks that express an interest in learning. We have folks that express an interest in having us come and play. They find out about us through our Facebook page, or they find out about us through our website, and they have events. And of course, with the 250th anniversaries of the American Revolution, which will be over the course of the next 8 years, there's going to be a lot of things going on, and they are always interested in having fife and drum to help. And even in the 18th century, the fife and drum were used to help build some excitement. Oftentimes the musicians would be used to recruit. The drummers would go out with the recruiting sergeant. Fifers would go out and drummers with the recruiting sergeant to, wouldn't you love to be a part of this? And so that was a big thing during that time.
Well, they certainly used you last night when we made the march into Waxhaw, North Carolina. I thought it was a fantastic display that y'all put on. Honestly, I learned something today, because I didn't realize that the red coats that you were wearing were actually a part of your Patriot garb. So kudos for teaching me something, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much.